Our 8th session of Research 101. I'm Margaret Lynn, Director of the Office of Clinical Research Development here at UTHSC, and I, along with Dorita Brand, Program Director for the Tennessee Clinical and Translational Science Institute, want to welcome you to Research 101. And if you're just now joining us, this is an 11-session series to provide basic information for research study contact. And hopefully we're going to be offering some advanced courses in between offering Research 101. So be looking for those notices that will be announced online. I want to thank Electronic Research Administration at UTHSC for all of their help in producing this series. During this Zoom meeting, your microphone is muted, so please leave those muted. We've had some success for the most part in producing these series without technical difficulty, but if something happens and we can't resolve it, then we'll just have to terminate the session and then post it online. You will receive an evaluation of the sessions by email, and after you complete that evaluation, you will receive your certificate of attendance. Dorita Brand and I, along with Risa Ramsey, who's providing support for nursing continuing education, have no real or apparent financial disclosures. So today our session is about source documents, and our speaker is Carrie Moore, RN, BS, CCRC, and she currently serves as the research director at LeBonheur Children's Hospital. She directs and manages efforts with UTHSC Institutional Review Board, LeBonheur researchers, and university staff, including training of clinical research coordinators. She's been a certified clinical research coordinator through the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, ACRP, for 18 years and a nurse for 27 years. Her prior experience includes manager of compliance and regulatory affairs, clinical research coordinator, and research manager. So we want to welcome Carrie, and if you have any questions, use your chat function, and at the end, if we have time, we will get to those and she can answer those questions. So Carrie, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be with everybody today, and I appreciate your attention. I hope everybody's staying well through this series. So, and through this time, I know it's been challenging, but it has been nice that UT has been able to work and put this together. So again, I'm excited to be with you. This is designed, as Margaret mentioned earlier, as a basic course. So we're going to talk about source documentation. I know that many of the other sessions have touched on informed consent. I know there are future sessions on monitoring. We'll talk about those things very briefly. Again, this is a basic course to talk about source documentation and the development of source docs. So, but I promise I have left time at the end for questions. So, okay, let me get my screen set and we're going to get started. Okay, so again, I wanted to share that I have no conflicts of interest or commercial support for this seminar. So again, I'm with LeBonheur Children's Hospital, and we'll move forward from there. My name is Carrie Moore, and the first thing I'm going to show you guys is a brief video. It probably takes just a second to load. But if anybody enjoys YouTube, it's called the Clinical Research Guy. And some of you may be familiar with the Clinical Research Guy. He has a lot of brief videos, but gives some good definitions about things in clinical research, especially if you're a new clinical researcher. You spend time trying to Google, find definitions of things. He gives a lot of
clinical
good information.
Researchers, I wanted to do a quick video on what a source document is in
Hold on.
Clinical research. So a source document is where any data that's going to be utilized as a data point for a clinical trial, where it originates from, where its source originates from. And this could be something like medical history, pharmacy records, a diagnosis, physician progress notes, vital signs, whether the vital signs are written on a post-it note or on the actual source documentation itself, lab results, EKG results. These are all source documents. Now, source can also be electronic source. And source can also be paper, and source can be written on sticky notes, and source can be on formal progress notes. Wherever that data point originated from is the source document itself, and this will then be entered into the case report form.
Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about, and I hear and I see or hear specifically a lot of questions on this from new researchers, is what is source, what are case report forms? And they are two different things. So I promise I won't read to you guys through this, but this is an important definition. So ICH defines source as original documents, as the video stated. Data and records, this can be hospital records, clinical or office outpatient notes, lab reports, memos, subject diaries that they enter at home and bring back from visits, checklists that you've formulated, pharmacy records, data from automated instruments. If you have electronic equipment that gives you printouts of vital signs or EKGs or any type test, that's source. Copies of transcriptions certified after verification of being accurate copies, and it goes on and on. Magnetic media, x-rays, but all the records that are kept that are the original point of origin, those are source documents. So it goes on to talk about case histories. So your source document should build for each subject enrolled in a study a case history of their participation in the study. So the regulation shares that an investigator is required to prepare and maintain adequate and accurate case histories that record all observations and other data pertinent to the investigation on each individual that has administered the investigational drug or employed as a control in the investigation. Case histories include case report forms and supporting data, such as signed dated consent forms and medical records, such as progress notes from the physician or hospital chart or nurse's notes. The case history for each individual shall document that informed consent was obtained prior to their participation in the study. So that's just a little background to talk about what is a source document. So in today's world, well, and I'll go back a little bit of time, as Margaret shared, I've been in research about 20 years now and a nurse for 27. So when I started nursing and even in clinical research, electronic medical records weren't an issue. Everything was paper. In ways, I think that was easier. In ways, electronic medical records have made our lives better, but it has definitely created challenges. Years ago, when you started a clinical trial, a sponsor, especially if it was a multi-centered trial, so a sponsor or a collaboration or collaborating group would send you a source document template, and that template would be everything you needed to fill out, and it would match up with a case report form. So let's talk about the difference. There is paper source, there can be electronic source, but that information that is from the source is then going to be transferred to a case report form. So a case report form is different than a source. It's a printed or electronic document that is created and used in a study or clinical research to capture standardized clinical data for each patient separately, and that transfers it to data management for review, for analysis. So now in today's world, we have paper source documents and electronic, and many studies combine those things. Depending on what the study activity is, what the procedure is, you might have paper records and electronic records going in the same study. So that is going to create your source document. So we're going to talk about electronic documents first. Electronic, I know many of you use electronic medical records. I think we may have people on here, contributors on our meeting today that are outside the system here. Cerner is our electronic medical record here, but whatever your system is, you're using data from your electronic medical record to support research oftentimes. So that's any combination of text, graphics, excuse me, it's going forward too fast, data, audio, pictures, or other information represented in a digital form that's created, modified, maintained, archived, or retrieved or distributed from the computer system. So there's some supporting information there, 21 CFR Part 11, Guidance for Industry Part 11 on electronic records, and electronic source data in clinical investigation. So those are some references where this information comes from. So electronic records, depending on the study, you want to make sure that you're using a validated computer system. So if this is a multi-center study, if you think back to the site selection visit, a clinical research associate or monitor from the pharmaceutical company is going to come to your site. They're going to come sit down with the study team, and they're going to ask the questions of where will source be captured. One of the things that now we see in multi-center studies is a source documentation verification checklist. It might have a different name, but they ask you to write down what is the source, or where is the verification of source. Will source be found in the electronic medical record? Will it be recorded on paper? How is the clinical research associate that comes to your site going to know where to look for the source and what is the true source? But they're also going to ask questions about validation. Do you have an audit trail for your electronic medical record? Can we know who's made changes to the record? Do we know when? Do we know who made the entries? Is it verified for electronic signatures, and are there support systems? So those things are very important. So then we'll shift over to paper. So many times coordinators prepare source documents as a study starts. Again, the days are gone that a multi-center study is going to hand you source document worksheets. Those were the, as we laugh and say, maybe the good old days. For your investigator-initiated studies, of course, you have to make your own data collection tools, your source documents, and oftentimes you're using REDCap or another way to share your data. But it is the study team's responsibility to ensure that they're capturing all the necessary data that's part of their protocol. So oftentimes we have to prepare these forms. So let's talk a little bit about that. There's key elements that you want to have in your source documentation, and we're going to dive into these a little deeper. You want to always show documentation of the consent process. That's essential. Again, we're going to dive deeper into all of these. We're going to look at study eligibility, statement of inclusion and exclusion, study procedures and interventions that are done as part of the study. We want to make sure we include adverse events, drug accountability if this is a drug study or device study, specimen collection, handling, and storage. If you're using a web response or interactive voice system for drug dispensation, just registering subjects in trials, and progress notes. So one of the things we'll go ahead and talk about is if you're creating source documents, you want to make sure that you are using all the tools that are available to you. When you're creating source documents, I urge you to use the schedule of events in your protocol. Read those footnotes. There's a lot of great information in those footnotes that you want to show information that you are familiar with everything that the protocol states. In addition to the schedule of events, also look at the protocol where it outlines each procedure, because that will also give you specific information. So we'll talk more about that, but some set things for ensuring that you have good source documentation worksheets, if you're creating those yourselves, is that every source document should be identifiable. You want to have the subject header on, or the subject identifier on every page in the header. You want to have the protocol identified. You want to have a place to ensure that you show who collected the information and the date the information was collected. So those are things that you want to have on every page of your source. So we're going to go ahead and start with informed consent documentation. This is the case history for each individual that documents that informed consent was obtained prior to study participation. Best practice for informed consent documentation is to record on the source document worksheet that informed consent was obtained prior to a procedure required by the clinical investigation, or to record the time the consent was obtained and the time of the first study procedure performed. So you want to ensure that informed consent is fully documented in your source. Oftentimes, I know on the UT IRB website, there is a template that we use. I know here at Le Bonheur, we have a template for informed consent documentation, but the important thing also to remember with informed consent, and I know you've heard this, is that informed consent is a process. It's not a one-time thing, sign the form and done. So we want to ensure that we are showing in our documentation that informed consent is a process, that we are available to answer questions, that we are engaging the subject and making sure that they are still willing to stay in a trial, that all their questions are answered. So it's important to continue to document those things on subsequent visits. So these worksheets and templates that are used, it's important to not just initial those bars or circle yes, because it becomes a standard form. It loses some of its documentation or loses some of its validity when they're all the same. There's no specific information regarding your subject. So it's okay to add information to those sheets. If I'm looking at study records, if I'm doing an audit, I want to see who all was involved in the source or in the informed consent process. Here at Le Bonheur, we have parents, of course, involved. If you're doing adult studies, was the spouse there with the patient? Who all asked questions? What questions were asked? Those are really important things to share in your source document. Who's in the room while this is going on? If the coordinator is obtaining consent, then is the PI available, or is another investigator in the room? Is that investigator answering questions as well? So it's really important to include those things in your source documentation. You can add those things to the bottom of a template worksheet, or you can use a progress note to document those things, but please document those things. That's the important thing there. So brief example, just some things that you want to include in your source documentation for informed consent. Was informed consent obtained? Yes. The date, the time, and who obtained consent. Was a copy given to the subject or parent? Yes or no. And those are straight from some of the templates that you see used by many institutions. Again, you don't have to use a template. You can write all this in a progress note. That's up to you. But the important thing is to try to individualize it as much as possible to show everything that was done during the process. Again, remember that it is an ongoing process and not a one-time thing. Often in research, I think people believe that just having that informed consent document itself, the informed consent form, is enough documentation, but it's not. Most auditors, monitors, investigators want to see the process documented with supporting documentation. So that's really important. Regulations such as 312.62 really talk about case history for each individual, and they want to show that informed consent was obtained prior to participation in the study. So again, we're going to go back and talk about those times that informed consent was obtained. I know that time is on the consent form here with our IRB, but depending on the institution, time may not be on the consent form. So it's important that you can show that informed consent was also obtained prior to participation in the study, prior to any procedures. So if informed consent is obtained at 10 a.m., when were labs drawn? When was the physical exam done? If these things are all study procedures, then those procedures need to be done after the consent was obtained. And we, especially, on that first visit where maybe those things were all done in one day, please make sure that you have clear documentation that that consent was done first. I think that's one of the most important things that an auditor is going to look for. Again, we talked about the time, we talked about who is involved in the process. So some common audit findings on informed consent documentation is that there is no source documentation of the consent process, or the documentation that the subject was provided a copy of the consent. So on the template, often I know at UT and Le Bonheur, we see that that's part of the template. We can initial that is done. If you're not using a template, please make sure you document that a copy was given to the subject and that everything was complete. One of the things that we also see, and I know this gets into the informed consent process, is to make sure that your subject did sign everywhere that they're supposed to sign, initial the pages that they're supposed to initial, that everything is dated. Some of our consent forms get quite lengthy and it takes a minute to go through, but it will save you time in your documentation and save deviations and issues in the long run if you will just take the time to go through each page and make sure everything is complete. So I do urge you to do that. So I'm going to move on then now to documentation of inclusion and exclusion criteria. So in source documents, there should be a listing of your inclusion exclusion criteria, or some way to show that your subject meets criteria for the study. They meet all the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria. Many people use a list. They cut and paste the list from the protocol and put yes or no beside it. That's sufficient documentation. That's fine to do. Sometimes a study will provide worksheets that have the inclusion exclusion criteria there. So you can support that documentation. If one of your criteria is a lab value, you want to make sure that lab value is available so that monitor or auditor can see what's there. Importantly, there should be a statement in your study records that state something to the effect that this subject is eligible for the study, they meet all the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria, and that this was all reviewed prior to randomization and signed by the PI. If the PI is not available, then one of your other investigators should sign this to show that this patient was eligible to continue to participate and be randomized in a study before any of those activities take place. So again, please make sure that that's something that you're documenting. Back to your protocol specific worksheets. I'm going a little bit out of order, so forgive me. But many study teams develop protocol specific worksheets for each study visit to include procedures that need to be performed. If you work in divisions, a lot of times you have some generic source document worksheets, you know, physical exam, adverse events, medication logs. So you can pull those forms and make a source document for your specific protocols and use those, and maybe sometimes tweak those and make them more individual. But again, all source documents should include subject identifiers, the protocol visit number and date of visit, the subject state prior to the initiation of any study procedures. It's important to note that the subject came in, are they having an adverse event? Are they not having adverse events? Are they doing well? Study medication accountability, adverse events, results of study specific evaluations, and their status at the time of study termination. So each visit is going to hold a lot of information for each subject. We'll look more at some visits as we go on, and then we'll look at progress notes. And so you can kind of wrap up the visit and summarize the visit. So here's an example. It's just like a cut and paste from a worksheet. So one of the things we see, especially if you are using electronic medical records, is it's hard to show if you have vital signs obtained from Cerner and their blood pressure is there and it's documented as 120/80 and their pulse is 60, that's great. But maybe your protocol asks that that subject be seated for 10 minutes prior to collection of that. How do you show that when you're using an electronic source for your study? How do you show that you're meeting those protocol specific guidelines? So if you're in that situation, I would encourage you to maybe make a worksheet that's a supplement to your electronic records, if that's the situation. So you can make a checklist. You can say the subject is seated at 8:15, vital signs were recorded at 8:25 if you're there for that portion. So it's important to show, and these are the things that you find buried in your protocol in those footnotes and all those places when you go into the visit descriptions. But these are the things that people are going to, and when I say people, I mean auditors, monitors, they're going to look for to ensure you're compliant with the protocol, and your source should support that information for you. So time seated, time performed, that may be the same, it may be later, but you need to know what your protocol says about that. So this is just a brief example of how you could document something like that. Medical history example, this is one of those forms that you could make a standard form and use over and over again. The one thing I would encourage you to do is to look at your protocol and know all the areas that the protocol wants addressed. You've got, this example just has cardiovascular, respiratory, GI, other, so this is a brief example. But how specific do they want to get? How far back does the history need to go? Your protocol should share that information with you. So make sure all the areas that are addressed in your protocol are addressed in your source. One of the things that happens with medical histories and physical exams, investigators, physicians, nurses, we get in a hurry, we do our standard exam. You have a physical exam, and maybe you were supposed to do a GU exam for the protocol, but that's not part of your standard, and the patient's gone and you're like, oops, I didn't do that. So then you have a deviation to your protocol. So it's important to know what your protocol is requesting and to make sure that you have a guide that reminds you that that is a field that you need to collect. So again, we talk about medical history and physical examinations together. Again, if physical exams are documented in the electronic records, then that's your source document. You can print these, or you can have your monitor view them in the EMR. Depending on what works at your site. I know some sites are able to give monitors access to EMR, Cerner, whatever your system is, and some are not. Some have to print and do different things. But you want to, again, ensure that all body systems are completed on the physical and match with your case report form. That's definitely one of the findings we see the most in trying to verify source documentation, is that there are body systems missing, that maybe a brief physical was done, but the protocol called for a full physical and there are areas missing. Questionnaires and surveys are always fun. These seem to be very popular in clinical research. Sometimes I know in visits, you know, this part alone can take an hour. One thing to remember is all your questionnaires and surveys must be IRB approved. They need to all include the subject number, the date they were completed, the visit number, and who completed the survey. If the survey is electronic and you're handing the patient like an iPad or you're sitting them at a computer, the source document should note what survey was done and who completed the survey and the time that it was transmitted to the data center. So please, you know, with your surveys, a lot of times there won't be a place to indicate who completed the survey. Here at Le Bonheur, most of the time our parents complete surveys. So which parent for us? That's a great question. Was it mom? Was it dad? Who came to the visit? So it's very important to be able to determine where that data came from. So we'll shift to adverse events. Adverse events and serious adverse events should be assessed at every subject visit and all phone contacts. So source documents should include, have you had any new symptoms or problems since your last visit? Have you been to the doctor or hospital since we spoke or saw you last? Have you had any changes in the study drug, and such as like when you had your cold and did you restart it? Did you hold drug for any reason? So adverse events should be assessed at every contact with the subject. Adverse events can be as simple as a cold that we talked about, or it can get very detailed and move into serious adverse events. I know that was I believe a course that, or a session that you've had or is upcoming, so I'm not going to get into the definition of those, but we want to make sure we're documenting all data around our adverse events. So adverse event documentation should include a description of the event. One of the things, you know, as a patient will love to come in and tell you they're vomiting, they have nausea, they maybe have heartburn, all these different symptoms. We want to look and determine if they saw a physician, did that physician diagnose them with gastroenteritis? Then gastroenteritis would be your adverse event. If they have cold symptoms and they went to the doctor and they were diagnosed with an upper respiratory infection, then that upper respiratory infection is your adverse event. Now, if they didn't see a physician and they treated themselves at home, you have to go with what they tell you, of course. So in your description of the event, try to be specific, try to use medical terminology if at all possible, if they've sought medical care. Your start date. So start dates can get a little confusing. Maybe they went to the doctor today, today's the 16th, but they started having symptoms on the 12th or 13th. Then your start date may be the 12th. It might have started as a mild event. Then things can change. Things can change to a serious adverse event as we go on. So you have to look at your start date and document as you go forward with the event what's going on with the subject. The severity of the event, mild, moderate, or severe, remembering that one event can change and move through. It can start as mild, move to moderate or severe, it can go backwards. Is this a serious adverse event? And there is a difference between serious and severe. So we want to make sure that we are documenting appropriately what's going on with the patient, and with our documentation, if this is a serious adverse event, include in the documentation that we have reported a serious adverse event per our IRB specification and per the sponsor specification. Is the adverse event related to an investigational product? That's something that your investigator is going to have to share, but that should be weighed in your source documentation. what action was taken with the investigational product? Was it interrupted? Did they continue taking it throughout the adverse event? Was it discontinued? Were any non-drug therapies or medications taken for this event? If we had an upper respiratory infection, did someone take Tylenol or Advil or Robitussin or Claritin? We need to document those things. There is a separate spot on a ConMed log, but that's a treatment for this adverse event, and that should as well be documented in your source. Another area that's become very important in recent years is this an unanticipated event or an adverse event of special interest? If it's an adverse event of special interest, your protocol, especially on your multi-center protocols, is going to share that with you. One of the ones we see frequently are, elevated liver enzymes, different lab abnormalities that can be an adverse event. So there may be additional forms or data that the sponsor requests for adverse events of special interest. Unanticipated events, those kind of things may have additional reporting requirements, but those are things, again, that you would work with your IRB and your study sponsor on. So this is one of my favorite little cartoons. You never know what's going to happen during a study visit. So adverse events happen all the time. So one of those things you just have to document. So sometimes you have to find a little humor there. This is just an example of an adverse event log. There are lots of great forms available out there. You can, if you don't have an adverse event log, I know here at Le Bonheur we have some standard forms that we can share with our study teams, but this was one we quickly found just on a Google search, so I wanted to share this. I would probably make a few changes. I would add, is this an anticipated or unanticipated event? But this is a great example of a form that you can use for your subjects as you go through. So you would list the adverse event term, you have start date, you have stop date, severity, which is mild, moderate, or severe. Then on this form, we have life-threatening, disabling, or death. Relationship should be documented. You have unrelated, unlikely, possible, probable, indefinite. Remember, that is for your investigator, your PI, to determine. Action taken with the investigational product, and the outcome. One of the things that an auditor or monitor are going to look for in your source documentation of adverse events is, did your investigator or PI, or who is delegated on your delegation of authority log to determine causality of an adverse event? Did they do that here? This is where they're going to look to show that the PI is reviewing these adverse events. Did your investigator make this determination? Is your investigator or your PI showing oversight? So it's really important to document on this, or this type of form, have some kind of way to show that your investigator is reviewing these adverse events and reviewing them in a timely manner. So notice you've got the start date here. So if we have a start date of 6/15, yesterday we had an adverse event, and at the end we have initials and date where your PI is going to sign off on this, and he signs it a month later. I would want my PI to know about an adverse event before that. So monitors are going to look at these things. Auditors are going to look at these things. So it's not just that you have the data there. Are you showing oversight that your PI, your investigative team, are reviewing this documentation and signing off in a timely manner so they are aware of what's going on with all their subjects in a study? So let's move on to investigational product accountability. So in addition to adverse event logs, let's add more logs. We have investigational product logs. So when you are doing a drug study, you are going to receive a shipment or an initial shipment of study drug from your sponsor, and you are going to go through and inventory your shipment, and you should have investigational product documentation or accountability logs, whether the sponsor provided those or not, or you have those on your own. You want to have this type of record. You want to know how many bottles were received, if it's bottles or blister cards, however it's shipped to you. The date it was received, was it received in good condition? So if you have 10 packs of pills and study subject 1 is ready for their visit and they're randomized and you assign investigational product, you're going to go back to that log and you are going to dispense one of those 10 according to the IXRS or however your protocol specifies that you dispense. But how many pills were dispensed, how many pills were dispensed, what was the date they were dispensed, of course, you're going to document in your source any type of instruction you gave on how to take the medication. Does it need to be taken with food? Does it need to be taken in the morning? Is it a twice a day dose? Those things are extremely important. Are there diaries related to the study medication? Does the patient need to record anything related to the study medication on the diary? So this type of documentation is extremely important. This is a big source of findings in audits that medication accountability is not documented correctly. So if you document that you dispense 30 pills to your patient, they come back 20 days later, you put the date of return and they returned 25 pills, we have a compliance problem. So we want to know, is this patient compliant? That should also be found in your documentation. They come back for that second visit after randomization. Are they 100% compliant? Maybe they're 98% compliant. That's great. They forgot a dose. That's wonderful. But if they're 50% compliant or any other range, we need to know that percentage of compliance. That should be included. We want to show how they're doing on their medication. If there's an issue, it does not necessarily mean they need to come out of the study. It means we need to show and document re-education. We need to include that in our source documentation. Maybe the patient misunderstood. If they were supposed to take the pills twice a day, maybe they took them once a day. We need to know what's going on, question the subject, and try to put any comments in our source documentation that explain what's going on with the subject and their issues with accountability. Here's an example of a drug accountability log. This, again, is one that we found on a very quick Google search. If you don't have one for your investigator-initiated studies, these forms are available. And if there's anything, like I said, you need, then you can create these. But these logs and records are so important to show how you're managing the drug. So you've got the protocol number, the drug, lot numbers, and note that separate log must be maintained for each lot received. Sometimes I see that at the top, and then at other times you'll have a space for lot number in the columns. So, but the lot number, in addition to the lot number, another thing that's really important is expiration dates. So you want to make sure that you try to include that on your drug accountability logs. So use a form like this. It's great to have some documentation. You always want to document who dispensed the drug. So you see in these columns where you've got received from drug supplier, date received, you've got a shipment number, number of bottles, and it's got initials. It's really important, whether it's the coordinator, a research assistant, a pharmacist, whoever is receiving that drug, to initial. And that person that initials there should be delegated on the delegation of authority log to handle that function. The PI should have delegated that duty to the person who's handling the drug. And as an auditor or monitor, they're going to look to see who's doing these procedures, who's handling the study medication, and is that being done according to the delegation of authority log. So it's a lot of pieces to put together. So one of the things I definitely like to talk about, I'm a big fan, are progress notes. Progress notes are not a requirement, although I would love to make them a requirement. That's my secret wish. But again, they're not a requirement. But at Le Bonheur, we're working to make those part of a requirement. Progress notes can be done in different ways. There can be worksheet templates. There can be just blank line forms. You can type these in the EMR. You can handwrite these. The importance of a progress note is the documentation and the information you share. So for a progress note, I always want to share the date of the visit. So here's a brief example. Subject 001 came to the clinic today for visit 2 for the lipid study. The subject reports no changes in medications, but did have an AE of nausea. I included the date. The nausea lasted for 24 hours. The subject did not take any medications for this event. The subject returned study medication. 7 tablets were returned, 7 taken since the last visit. They're 100% compliant with dosing. Dispensed a new drug kit with the kit number to the subject today with instruction along with the diary. Reviewed diary completion instructions. All study procedures were completed according to the protocol. Labs were obtained without difficulty and shipped to the central lab. We scheduled the next visit and the date and instructed the subject to call the study site with any questions, concerns, or changes in their health status. That is an example. I strongly encourage you, if you do not have progress notes as part of your source documents, I strongly encourage you to consider adding it. Like I said, I've showing my age, but I've been in clinical research for a long time, and I've been through audits and different things. And these progress notes really tell a story of what happened and what's going on with the patient throughout the life of your trial. This brings it all together. It summarizes it for the person who's reviewing the record. It helps it make sense. Everything is there at your fingertip. You don't have to dig for information. It really does make a big difference. If there's anything I could encourage you to do as part of your source documentation is to summarize each visit in a progress note. In addition to the visits, anytime you have a phone communication, any communication with the patient or subject for the study, include that in the progress note. It's really important and gives, again, that full case history of everything that happens with the subject in the study. This is an example template. This is, again, one we found on Google, where you can just freehand write whatever you want. Again, it's important to have the subject identifier, the study title on there. It's always important and required that whoever completed the progress note signs and dates, the progress note as they go through. It's great when I see and I go through and maybe the coordinator has reviewed and documented a progress note, and then the investigator can go through and add information. That's amazing to see. It shows PI oversight. So those things are really, really important as you go through. Again, it's not a requirement, but I do urge you to think about that and consider it. So as we've gone through, we've talked about a lot, and I think I've been talking for a good little bit now, but some general good documentation tips. Every study visit and conversation with the subject should be documented in your clinic study record source file. If it's not electronic, then it should be on paper. All documentation should be completed in blue or black ink. Whiteout should never be used. All emails or faxes sent to the site related to a research subject should be printed and filed. All documents included in the source should be Alcoa compliant. We're going to talk about Alcoa in a few minutes. And corrections should be made with a single line through the error, adding initials and date, and noting the corrected information. One of the things I would strongly urge, and we still see, unfortunately, is whiteout used to cover an incorrect entry. Excuse me. And we still see people scratching through an entry and like totally obliterating what was written. And those definitely raise areas for concern. The true correct way to correct an error is that single line, so you can still see what was originally written or entered, initialing and dating, so we know who made the correction. It's the same thing with an audit trail. So please make sure that we are doing those things. So let's talk about Alcoa compliance. So all data should be attributable. We should know who completed the data, who entered the data. That's when we talked about a progress note. Who wrote the progress note? Please sign off. Who completed each page of the source? Please initial or sign your name at the bottom. Who entered information in the drug log? Initials go there. So every piece of paper, everything that's done in the study should be attributable. Everything should be legible. You can document everything, but if we can't read it, we kind of have a problem. Contemporaneous, accurate, and original. So it's really important that the records stand for themselves as a monitor or auditor come in and look at your data, that everything is as it should be. So here's an Alcoa checklist. It's kind of small, but this is a form that's been around a long, long time. The old adage, if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. That's one we've heard for a long time, not just in clinical research, but in medicine as well. So this again goes back into the definitions of the Alcoa attributable. It should be obvious who created a record and when it was created. If a record was changed, it should be obvious who made the change, when the change was made, and why. Legible, that goes without saying, we need to be able to read it. Contemporaneous, study evidence and results should be recorded as they are observed. All signatures should be attached to a date indicating when the signature was added to the document. Original, study records should be originals, not photocopies. Accurate, study records should have a high level of integrity and honesty as to what was truly observed and give a full accounting of research process. Study records should be thorough and correct. Work should be double checked for unintentional errors and complete. Investigators and institutions should maintain adequate, accurate, and complete source documents. So there are some common problems when reviewing, and we've talked about a few of these things as we've gone through today. So missing source documents, or not missing, but missing source documentation includes incomplete or incorrect investigational product accountability, incomplete questionnaires. Often I look at questionnaires when I'm reviewing. I have no idea who completed the questionnaire. I have no idea when the questionnaire was completed. It might be visit 6, but was visit 6 today? Was it 5 years ago? We need to know when that happened. Incomplete assessments such as physical exams, use of whiteout, excuse me, unsigned and dated entries, lack of documentation of adverse event assessment and attribution by the investigator. Coordinators can have beautiful documentation, study nurses, other study team members, but if your PI is not showing oversight, your investigators are not showing oversight for the study, your PI is ultimately responsible, then you still have an issue. Lack of documentation related to investigational product dispensing, subject compliance, product return, and education and instruction. Those things are extremely important as well. So when your monitor comes for your study, if it's a sponsored or collaborative study, or if you're here at Le Bonheur, we try to audit our PI-initiated full board studies to help meet those regulations. You set up a time and somebody comes and they're going to look at all your records. Whether they're doing an electronic review or a paper review or a combined review, they want to verify that everything you've done is accurate, it's complete, that it's legible, and they can show what's been done. So they want to, excuse me, record and review all the observations and protocol related data. They want to see that you're using the same standardized forms for all subjects across the study. So if you have 4 patients in a study and 1 patient is documented everything on paper and 1 is done electronic and the 3rd and 4th are just a mix of that, there's going to be a question as to why. You want to use the same consecutive method throughout. The other thing we want to make sure is that if you have created a source document or if source document was provided, a template worksheet was provided for you, and there are changes in the study, if there's an amendment, that you update the version to match the current version of the protocol. So you start a study and the inclusion criteria are a set of criteria, and something changes 3 months into the study and you have an amendment, then you've got to go back and make a change. So your monitors, your auditors are going to look at those things. So your source documents, you want to look at version control. You're going to have to save these documents and have updates as things change in the study. Sometimes visits are added, all those things. So labs are added, labs are taken away. Additional data points are added, so we have to make sure that our documents line up and we are reflecting those changes that happen as they're IRB approved and they're added to our study. Source documents should be organized. They should be easy to find the information that your monitor or auditor needs to review. Again, they should show an accurate case history of the subject's participation in the study. You don't want to, excuse me, you don't want to have an auditor or monitor go through and dig for information. It should be easy to find. It should be legible. It should be in order. So take that time to ensure that things are in date order, that you can follow the visits, that you can show the progression of the participant throughout the course of the trial. So source document review, the CRA, the monitor, is responsible to verify personnel performing study-specific tasks. And we talked about that earlier, ensuring that who is completing study procedures, they're delegated to do that task on the delegation of authority log. So your monitor is going to want to look at this when they're there and they're going to compare. So a definite finding in an audit or monitoring visit could be if you have someone that is performing study procedures, but they're not delegated to do that. You can have beautiful documentation, but if you're not delegated to do that task, you still have an issue. The monitor will verify that collected and recorded data was documented at the time the measurement was taken. All source documentation should correspond with the time frame, leaving no concern for data integrity. The monitor is also going to review that all data points collected from the trial, or they're going to review all data points for the study, no matter in what form, electronic or paper, and they want to ensure that data is legible and original. So if you collected a blood pressure or any kind of recording on a sticky note, and that's, you know, the famous thing is, what if I wrote it on a sticky note? It's okay to take that sticky note and tape it to a piece of paper so you have that as part of your source. The monitor is also going to review source documents for accuracy. Any trends in data collection, such as inconsistency, should be brought up during the monitoring visit, should be discussed, and a plan established to make any needed revisions in the source to make sure all data is collected as the protocol indicates. So I think I've left a few minutes for questions. I know I've talked a lot, so I'm going to turn it back over to, I don't know if I turn it over to Margaret or Dorita, I'm not sure, but.
Margaret, were there any questions in the chat for Carrie?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had my mute on. The first question is, can the timing between signing consent and first study procedure not be inferred from the progress note? So maybe you can just go over once again how to make sure that that first procedure happens or is noted after the consent form.
So the question is, can timing be inferred by the progress note? I think that the answer to that would be, it depends on the progress note. I think it depends on how it's documented. So if you establish the time on your consent form, and let's say, for example, the subject signs the consent at 10 a.m., and the progress note shows the first study activity, such as maybe obtaining medical history or doing vital signs at 10:15, then yes, you can show that. But if those times are not there, then that leaves room for question. So I hope that answers that question for you.
Carrie, you also probably could just say that the informed consent process was completed before any subject
Absolutely.
procedures, right?
Yes, and that's in the informed consent template, that the informed consent process was, and informed consent was obtained prior to the completion of any study procedures. So that should be in your, whether you decide to document informed consent in a progress note or a template form, that should be one of those statements.
Okay, the next question is, where do you house these progress notes? Do you make them part of the official subject study binder?
Yes, here we put those with the rest of our source documents. So they are with each visit. Now, everybody does this in a different way. That's not required. Again, progress notes are not required. It's something that I believe is very helpful in documentation. But at Le Bonheur and where I have worked previously, we have housed those with the study visit itself. So I would have a progress note for visit 1, 2, and so on. And that was part of my study visit.
Okay, so the next question is, how appropriate is electronic documentation? Not really sure whether that means the progress note or source documents, or maybe you can take a stab at all those. Okay.
Sure. Electronic documentation is definitely the way things are moving. For those who are still doing paper, you know, most organizations want to move to a fully electronic system. E-source is something that, if you look out there, there are many companies that are working on that. So I think we will be moved more and more into that world if you're not already partly there. So electronic source is good. It's just that we want to make sure we're showing that that is the first point of origin for the data. Electronic progress notes, if there's a way to do a communication document in your EHR, your EMR, then that's fine. I think electronic records are great. I would love to see us move more to that side of things. It just takes time. But you just have to make sure all the information is available, that you can show it. You know, one of the issues that many people have with electronic records, some of your sponsored studies, they're not allowed to look at your electronic systems where some want access. So then they want you to go in and print everything. And that creates a whole other problem because the whole point is to not have to do that. So there are still issues that we all as sites, as researchers are working out with these things. There's not always easy answers, unfortunately, but I'm definitely, my personal opinion is in favor of electronic documentation. I want to see us move more in that direction.
Well,
Okay,
I'm sorry.
oh, go ahead, Dorita.
This is Dorita again. And just like Carrie said numerous times throughout the presentation, like your source document is the first time you document an event. So your source doc could be just electronic, like your lab results, test results, things like that. So
It can, and this is Carrie, it can also be your physical exam. If your physician investigator is doing your physical exam and the first place they enter that is in Cerner here, you know, at our facility, then that Cerner record, that electronic record is your source. So.
hey, Carrie, do you want to allude a little bit about don't double document, because then that might lead to errors and stuff?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I definitely see, and I've seen this for years, as EMRs came into practice, is your physician will put their physical exam in the EMR. It's beautifully documented. So then a coordinator, thinking they're doing the right thing, and oftentimes they've been asked by a monitor, the monitor will still request that the source document worksheet be filled out. So then they take that Cerner or whatever system physical exam, they transcribe it on a source document worksheet, and then again it's transcribed to put in a case report form. That is like double, triple doing. It's not necessary. The source is Cerner, that data can be then transferred into the case report form, but we do see people do that. They do it with great intention, but it's not necessary. And what happens when you take that extra step is it increases your likelihood for errors. So I would encourage you to try to get away from that. If you have a monitor asking you to do that, I would ask questions back, because that's not a practice you want to try and follow.
Yeah, I think, Carrie, these are the next two questions, and
Okay.
it relates to what you were just saying. The first one is, if we are trying to minimize paper use due to COVID, should we still create a subject file for each research subject? That's the first part. And then should we also print copies of our digital process notes to keep with the subject source documentation file?
So with source documents related to COVID, I think you're going to have to work with your institution and your research team. And it depends on your study. You know, if your study has a lot of standard of care activity, then most of your data will be electronic. Or you can, if it's not, I'm trying to think my way around this question. If you have procedures, of course, then that are specifically research procedures, but you can document those in your electronic medical record. I think that's a great practice to try to reduce paper use, contamination, those kind of things. So I definitely follow what you're thinking. But again, I think you're going to have to work with your study team on that and your institution. The second question, or the second part of that question, Margaret, can you repeat that for me?
Should we also print copies of our digital process notes to keep with the subject source documentation file?
I would encourage you to, I don't think that's necessary. You know, the whole point of the electronic medical record is to be electronic. So then if you're printing everything, in a way it defeats the purpose. So the thing that happens is your monitor or auditor is going to want a view. So if you can give them a read-only access with limited subjects, or the subjects that are just in your study, and they can review the data, that's great. If you need to do a over-the-shoulder view so they can look at the data during the visit, that's great. I would not try to print everything. It defeats the purpose, in my opinion. I know many monitors and many other people have differing opinions. That's my opinion.
I agree with you, Carrie. And on sometimes your monitors will almost require you to do that. So one way around that maybe is for your department or institution or whatever to have like an SOP stating that, you know, you'll give, in the regulations and the guidance, it only says that we'll allow monitors and auditors and regulatory authorities to view our documents. It doesn't say how they can review. So you might just want to design a SOP for that for your individual department.
And then I think the last comments are about using blue or black ink, no whiteout. And then the question is, how do we make corrections to text in an electronic file? How do we record the editing of an electronic file?
I think it depends on the electronic system that you're using. So I think, you know, let's say there's an error, just like you would in regular practice. If you entered a vital sign incorrectly, then if you go back and correct that, there's going to be an audit trail that shows what that correction was. Now, if you entered something today during a visit and then you need to make a correction a week or two later, that changes things. So, you know, if you wrote, you know, 180 instead of 120, that's a quick fix and your audit trail is going to capture that data today. Later on, it may be that you have to type in a communication note or clarification note to correct. And that may be, again, you know, we're all using different systems depending on our organization, that you might check with your IT department on the best way to do that. But if there's a note made to clarify or correct anything related to research, I would definitely reference the document that it's correcting and explain why the correction is being done.
And I think that's the last one.
All right. Thank you, Carrie. That was an awesome presentation, very informative on source docs. We really appreciate you giving this training for us today. And thanks to everyone for attending session 8. Our next session will be this coming Thursday, and the topic will be event reporting. We hope all of you can attend and join us on that date. And thank you again, everyone. Have a good rest of the day and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Carrie, you want to stay on?
everybody going?
I think we're
Yeah.
Finally, I've removed everybody.
Yeah, I was removing everybody too.
Oh,
So,
are you? I removed this Gina
Yeah.
Harris, whoever she is, like 3 times and it wouldn't go away.
yeah.
Very good. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
Carrie, it was
Carrie.
so good and it went so smoothly.
Yes.
Yes.
Yay!